Hello again and welcome to Forum for a Better Understanding. Last week, if you were here, you know we had two professors from Fresno State share with us their real excitement over Flannery O'Connor. But today we're going to shift gears. We've brought back the two professors, but we're going to talk about another person from that same time who died 4 years later, who is also a major American Catholic figure of the 60s. And that would have been Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, who was not only a spiritual writer, but a tremendous peace advocate and a spiritual master, especially in the area of interfaith, especially with Buddhism, especially with breaking into interests way beyond the simplicity of living in a cloistered life in Gethsemane in Kentucky. But we have people who actually come from Kentucky and actually know all about this. Our first guest is Howard Hendrix. Professor Hendrix is a professor, obviously, at California State University, Fresno. And to his side is his colleague and a new friend of mine, Lisa Weston, another professor of literature at California State University. Thank you, doctors, for being here today. Again, we're going to see a very wonderful clip about Thomas Merton, prepared by Religion and Ethics for the 40th anniversary of his death. But before we do, is there a single thought you'd like to share about your own feelings for the importance of Father Lewis or Thomas Merton?
Well, I could start. I'm not born in Kentucky. I went to school there, Covington Latin School, and that's where I first heard about Merton, because Gethsemane was just sort of those places that you heard about, and Merton had died not too many years before I was in high school. What was interesting in going back and rereading Seven Storey Mountain was it struck me, yes, this is a spiritual autobiography, and there's a long tradition of spiritual autobiographies, but it's a very particular type of spiritual autobiography. It's a post-Freudian spiritual autobiography. It's something written after Freud, and it has this, the amazing thing to me about it, he wrote it in the scriptorium as essentially a devotional exercise, 2 hours a day, okay? That was how the book got written. But the thing that was fascinating to me was just the level of detail of his own childhood that he still had. I could not do that. I couldn't go back and remember all these things. It's just incredibly detailed. It's very much also someone who comes to faith through writing and reading. His fascination with Blake and with Gerard Manley Hopkins really become a part of his conversion to Catholicism. And I'm reminded of a book and film called The River Runs Through It, which of reverses that and talks about the fact that in the family that's chronicled there, all the preceding generations had all become pastors. They all become Episcopalian ministers, I think it is. And the narrator, and really Norman MacLean, becomes a literary critic because that's as close as he can get to being a religious person. What's bizarre here is that Merton starts out he's very much from a writerly family. His maternal grandfather, is a Grosset and Dunlap muckety muck. He comes out of that background. But what's strange with him is he moves from literary criticism to religious faith rather than seeing that family tradition with Norman MacLean of moving from. I can't have the sort of faith that my grandparents have, so I'll be a literary critic. Instead, he comes out of this tradition of literary criticism in the book world and moves into religious faith. And it's kind of an interesting turnaround.
Lisa, where is your main interest in Merton?
Well, for me, Merton is one of the figures that is very influential. And I'm the generation that is influenced by Seeds of Contemplation was the first Merton thing that I ran across, but soon after that, and Zen and the Birds of Appetite, and some of his the contemplative tradition, and so that's what particularly excites me about him. Though when I found out that we share like favorite poets, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and the wonderful aesthetic and the mix of the contemplative life not as a withdrawal from the world, but as a way of finding a space to engage with the world. And I think that's probably something we'll talk about later on too. But
What we're going to do right now is gift you again with another segment from Religion and Ethics, as we did last week. We'll roll that clip, we'll take our break, and then we'll come back and have our professors help us see more about Thomas Merton than perhaps we knew before.
We revisit today our story on Merton. Judy Valente reported from Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky.
Sunrise at the Abbey of Gethsemane in the misty hills south of Louisville, Kentucky. The 55 Trappist monks who live here awake at 3 a.m. to begin their daily regimen of prayer and work in silence. They gather for communal prayer several times a day. They will rarely venture outside the walls. For most, their lives will end here. The monks support the abbey by making fruitcakes and other products which are sold to the public. Much of the monastery's 2,300 acres is leased to local farmers.
The essence of the Trappist life would be living in God. And I don't think I would want to say much more than that. Of course, you're living in God with other people in the same community. And it's a life of continual prayer. And it's a life of deepening, going deeper into your own capacity to love and to live with God.
In 1941, Merton, then an aspiring young writer and a recent convert to Catholicism, arrived here, seeking to radically change his life. Merton was to have a striking message.
He said that anybody could have a deeply spiritual life if they cared to. Any person on the street, if they were committed to it and devoted to trying it, that path was open to them.
For Merton, the deeply spiritual life meant the experience of God's presence and love at all times, combining that with action in everyday life. Paul Pearson oversees the Merton Center at Bellarmine University in Louisville.
The essence of Merton's spirituality is, I think, the humanity of it, that he really speaks to ordinary people. He knows so well the great classics of Christian spirituality, but he can interpret them in a way that people in our world today can understand and can relate to.
He spoke especially to lay Catholics in what was then a firmly hierarchical church.
Spirituality really belonged to the monks and nuns and bishops and what have you, whereas your ordinary layperson went to Mass on Sundays. The Mass was in Latin. They said the Rosary, and that was the extent of it. And Merton, I think, really opened up that whole realm of contemplation and spirituality for people.
Merton's parents had died when he was young. By his own account, he lived a rootless, hedonistic life. It was rumored he had fathered a child out of wedlock while a student at the University of Cambridge. At New York's Columbia University, he continued to feel morally adrift, emotionally bereft. As a world-weary 26-year-old, Merton wrote these words, read by Morgan Atkinson.
Finally has come the time to go to the Trappist and try to get in and be completely quiet in front of the face of peace. It is time to stop being sick and really get well. Out here I could think, and yet I could not get to any conclusions. But there was one thought running around and around in my mind. To be a monk. To be a monk.
Thomas Merton not only became a monk, he would become a best-selling author and one of the most influential spiritual thinkers of his time. A fellow writer called him an investigative reporter going into the inner workings of the soul.
As a novice at Gethsemane, Brother Paul Quinnen received spiritual direction from Merton, known as Father Lewis.
He doesn't think the whole world is, are monks, but on the other hand, he can talk to the monk in each person. He sees it as a deep enough thing that somehow everybody has the capacity to come to that same kind of intensity and depth of experience of God.
Now, this exhibit is all of Merton's published work with their varying editions and the foreign translations. Merton's now been translated into, I think it's 30 languages.
In 1948, when he was 33 years old, Merton published his autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, taking his title from a scene in Dante's Purgatory. The book became an overnight bestseller. Sister Suzanne Zurcher is a Benedictine nun who has written extensively about Merton.
I knew that I needed to be in monastic life. And I knew that he was someone who spoke to me in a way that nobody else had ever spoken to me. He's funny, he's profound, he's human, he's down to earth, he's practical, he's concrete.
And this is the one, Conjectures, we just finished reading it.
Mike Brennan is a baggage handler for American Airlines in Chicago. His home is full of Merton books and memorabilia.
Working at O'Hare Airport, noisy, crazy, constant activity, constant stimulation. It's really nice to find a way to let go of all of that stimulus and activity and to think, about being connected with the Lord. And I learned that from Merton.
Merton's fame allowed him to correspond with presidents, popes, and Nobel Prize winners. But as his public reputation grew, he retreated further into solitude and silence. He would spend a few hours a day in this small wooden shed, writing and meditating. But it wasn't enough.
He wanted to have more time for writing, for meditation.
He would later get permission from his abbot to live as a hermit in this tiny cottage about a half-mile from the monastery.
He loved being in the midst of nature, The birds were his friends.
What do you think he did out here?
Well, he read a lot and wrote. For him, praying was just to abide in the presence of the Lord. There's the kitchen, and then a bedroom, and then a chapel was added later on.
Merton wrote this in his journal.
For myself, I have only one desire, and that is the desire for solitude. To disappear into God, to be submerged in His peace, to be lost in the secret of His face. I've gone to the hermitage not because I hate the world. I go to the hermitage to deepen my consciousness, to be more in communion with the world.
His output was enormous. Over a 20-year period, he would write 60 books on topics ranging from contemplative prayer to nonviolence. He also wrote poetry, essays, and criticism. In the 1960s, Merton became increasingly controversial. He began writing on issues of the day, like civil rights, materialism, and the nuclear arms race. His superiors blocked the publication of some of his most strident anti-war writings.
As he changed from the world-denying monk to the world-embracing monk of the 60s, people began to think, well, why should he be writing on these issues? He's away in a monastery. What does he know about them?
In 1966, Merton spent several weeks in a Louisville hospital recovering from back surgery. There he met and fell in love with a young student nurse. He was 51 years old at the time.
It was very brief, it was very intense, it was very passionate. He sometimes felt that he had abandoned his vows, and other times he felt he was really living the vows of growth and fulfillment.
The two would sometimes meet clandestinely in secluded parts of the monastery grounds. Within a matter of months, the relationship was over, but Merton had been changed.
From that time on, he never again thought of himself as being unloved or unlovable. And he himself learned to love in this relationship. And that was the part of himself that he always felt had been underdeveloped.
Merton rededicated himself to his monastic life. He became increasingly interested in Buddhism and Asian monasticism. In 1968, he received permission to attend a conference on monasticism in Bangkok. There is rare footage of Merton from that conference.
So that's a thing of the past now, to be suspicious of other religions and to look always at that which is weakest in other religions and always at what is highest in our own religion. this double standard in dealing with religion. This has to stop.
Hours after this film was made, Merton was dead, electrocuted after touching a fan with faulty wiring in his hotel room. He was 53. His reputation has only grown since his death. Working with manuscripts he left behind, scholars have published 60 more of his books, including 7 volumes of his personal journals. But, as a monk, Merton left behind few personal possessions. His work shirt, a cup, boots, eyeglasses.
With the death of Thomas Merton, we lost really one of the great Catholic voices, one of the great prophetic figures within the Catholic Church. And I think that's why his books are still selling, why they're still being translated, because that message is as relevant today as when he wrote it.
Toward the end of his life, Merton wrote, "Our real journey is interior." For those seeking to take that journey, he remains an essential guide. For Religion and Ethics News Weekly, I'm Judy Valente at the Abbey of Gethsemane.
Merton could turn a graceful phrase. In his famous book, The Seven-Story Mountain, he said when he entered Gethsemane Abbey and the gate closed behind him, he was finally surrounded by, quote, "the 4 walls of my new freedom."
For over 25 years, KNXT has been serving the people of the San Joaquin Valley with good family television that's just not available anywhere else. It's important for you, the viewer, to help support this valuable tool of ministry. KNXT needs to continue to grow and bring you important programming about your faith. But sometimes it's hard to stop and find the time. Make it easy. Go to knxt.tv and find out how easy it is to support your Catholic television station, KNXT TV.
Hello again, and welcome back to our discussion on Thomas Merton. If you were here last week, you know that there were so many layers or so many aspects of Flannery O'Connor. She defied being codified or classified and categorized in any way. I think Thomas Merton is definitely as complex as anyone else, and definitely something like his contemporary Flannery O'Connor. Lisa, besides him being a monk, a cloistered monk, a Trappist,
a hermit, in fact,
who went deeper into the woods than the others and hid himself in his own private little hermitage. Beyond that, what is another aspect of him that you find also intriguing in that he breaks the mold again of what's a simple classification?
Well, I think one of the assumptions that people have about monks and about people of religion in some ways is that they can't have any concern with the world. I mean, or they wouldn't go away and lock themselves away. But one of the things that Merton does is to get what in the popular imagination are 2 separate kinds of things and moves them together. And one of his books works on contemplation, and conjectures of a guilty bystander, and the concept of the term guilty bystander is one that he unpacks in a beautifully paradoxical way, charming and making something that is quite something that people outside the monastery will also go, yeah, I need that as a concept. That our term guilty bystander usually means somebody who is guilty because they are standing by. For him, however, the guilty bystander is somebody who can recognize the guilt and can recognize the problems of this world and figure out how to act on them. Because particularly through contemplative practice, they realize a lack of the divine or the distance from the divine, and are accepting of the redemption and accepting and moving forwards and working towards that unity with God, which sets them aside and then allows them to come back to the problems of the world. And that's a really deep and very complex position that brings in, like, what is this monk writing about segregation? What is this monk writing about nuclear disarmament? What is this? Why would somebody be engaged with the world in this way? And his response is, how can you not be engaged with the world that God has created and the sense of seeing the mystery of the world and seeing the world and working with it that way. So I think that's one of those sorts of things, and particularly the idea that while not abandoning one's own core faith, one can, in fact, embrace other religions as well, or release those suspicions. And the lovely statement that to the time of suspicion of other religions is of the past. Were it only. Read Thomas Merton. It should be. But.
Well, and I just want to follow up with that. Part of what Lisa is talking about there, too, is Merton is able to, and the Merton who is writing in Seven Story Mountain is different from the later Merton, okay? He is in some ways more rigid, but one of the reasons that he can talk outside the cloister is he can say, I've been there. I've been in your world. I've been in the world that is separated from God. I know what that's like. I've lived it. I was sick. I was ill. There's all these concentrations on bodily illness and spiritual illness all through the book. The Merton who comes up later and talks about, it's wrong to say, look at what is highest in our own religion and what is worst in other religions. He spends a lot of time in this book knocking other religions. Okay, he does. The Merton who comes up, who is more ecumenical, is a later Merton, but it's part of his journey. I just want to emphasize the fact that he keeps changing. Although there are some things that they're always. What's fascinating about Seven Story Mountain and Seeds Contemplation, a lot of his other works, is they're a critique of the world. He doesn't hate the world. He says, I don't hate the world. But there is a critique there. And even here, even as early as 1948 in Seven Story Mountain, he's talking about the nuclear arms race and saying, this is proof of how metaphysically screwed up we are as a species, is that we are at the point where we're going to annihilate ourselves. What other proof do you need? So when people ask, later on in the 60s, when he becomes very strongly anti-nuclear, very strongly anti-war, it's not really that big a change if you know Merton's earlier work, because he talks about, he has one quote, and it's not in Seven Story Mountain, I forget where it's from. He says, if you want to understand hell, understand contemporary politics.
Wow.
And it's a really great passage. Understand nations, and you will understand hell. And it's a really interesting idea, and it's ultimately about that distance from the divine. And his way of overcoming that distance is not to go out, but to go in. And when I read Merton, the thing that sometimes I think, wow, wouldn't it be great to just be able to go off and write and be alone? As a writer, that has a huge appeal to me. But he's doing it with a very specific intent, and that idea that only by going in can you go out, only by understanding the self in the world that God has created, the self that is created by God, can you understand the world. And that's a really big move.
And the idea that it's a journey, and it's a journey that's never actually quite completed. Mm-hmm. The idea, and then I discovered perfection and went into a monastery, and I was happy. No happy endings. It goes on. Mm-hmm. After Seven Story Mountain, there's the Sign of Jonah. There's the other books that he works on, and the sense that it's the process of the process that is important. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's no surprise that actually he goes into the monastery, and Seven Story Mountain is a World War II.
Yeah.
As a response, part of the response to a very screwed up world that he'd been growing up in. And then the world doesn't get any less screwed up, I suppose, but we can try, is a kind of the message. We can try, we can move. And he moves forward, and he does shift and turns.
And it is about process. There's that old line from Joseph Campbell who said, when you're on a journey, but the goal of the journey keeps changing, keeps shifting, maybe the goal is the journey, okay? And there's a lot of that in Merton.
And it's amazing that there's a prayer that I was wondering, will it fit in? And if I read it quickly, it may fit in, and it seems timely. It's called The Road Ahead, and here's what Merton said as a prayer about his own journey, which we're spending time on right now. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I have that desire in everything I am doing. Then he goes on, and finally the last thought. Therefore, will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Mm-hmm. To think that he not only could write 60 books in his lifetime and have 60 books posthumously published, but that in that one prayer, it seems to be the essence of a man on journey, never content. And the fact that he had to go to Bangkok in 1968 to continue this dialogue with Buddhism shows that he was still very much en route and was caught just as Flannery was dead at 39, Thomas is dead at 53, young people. What is left to say in the last 2 minutes?
Well, I guess both of these characters, but particularly Merton, and particularly with the emphasis on the journey, is that in some ways we who read his words are then put in a position of having to write the next book that he would have written, take the next step on his journey for him. And so we are never actually alone, even when we read his books, and you can always reread his books too, which is and see different things in them because you're now in a different space. And that awareness of the journey, I think.
Yeah.
30 seconds, Howard.
And part of that journey is that movement from the great loneliness that is the world, that is alienated from the divine, toward the divine, which is a lonely greatness, and calls us to a very difficult challenge. And Merton is about that, and he keeps working at it. He worked so hard, and I don't know if I could work that hard. He worked so hard. You think, oh, he's being a monk, how hard can that be? Yeah. No. You see the way he twists on it, and you realize that it is hard work.
Not all fruitcake baking.
No, it's the high, hard way. It is.
It's a tough life being a monk. What I'd like to do is thank our two guests, Dr. Howard Hendrix and Dr. Lisa Weston, who are here from California State University, Fresno, for these last two programs, sharing with us their own passion, not only for literature, but for life. Thank you very, very much. We'll be back next week with another forum. Please join us, and until then, God bless.